Greetings from the World Health Organization. My name is Chandra-Mouli, and I lead the work on adolescent sexual and reproductive health and rights in WHO. In this presentation, I'm going to speak to you about comprehensive sexuality education and the prevention of gender-based violence. My presentation has two parts. This is part one, and the key messages are: one, the prevention of gender-based violence through a gender transformative approach is a key focus of comprehensive sexuality education. Two, gender transformative approaches directed at children and adolescents are widespread. They've been applied widely, and well-designed and well-executed programs have been shown to produce tangible results, particularly in relation to knowledge and attitudes, and in some cases, behaviors, and in a smaller number of cases, health outcomes. The third and last point, is that the available evidence is that the effect of gender transformative approaches and comprehensive sexuality education on health outcomes in relation to gender-based violence are limited. However, there's powerful evidence of the impact of these interventions, or this particular intervention, a gender transformative approach, on the intermediate outcomes that contribute to gender-based violence, that lead to gender-based violence, as shown in the last point. Before I move further, a word about the definition of comprehensive sexuality education. A curriculum-based process of teaching and learning about the cognitive, emotional, physical, and social aspects of sexuality. This is the definition underpinning both the International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education, which is primarily focused on delivery in the school setting, a UN publication led by UNESCO, and the Outer School Comprehensive Sexuality Education resource guide developed by UNFPA, again on behalf of a number of UN agencies. CSC aims to do a number of things listed in the second paragraph, and its attributes are listed in the last paragraph. Gender equality is central to the UN approach and the wider approach to comprehensive sexuality education. In my previous slide, I talked about the gender equality being a central facet of our work, of the UN's work on comprehensive sexuality education, so building equitable gender attitudes and norms. And these 8 concepts are included in the UNESCO-led international technical guidance. And you'll see that there's a huge focus on gender, and this is concept 3, and a focus on violence and staying safe, which is concept 4. And these concepts are translated into age-appropriate and logically sequenced learning objectives and are taught using a variety of methods. So gender equality building, prevention of gender-based violence is a core component of the UN approach to comprehensive sexuality education. I'm now going to speak to you about an important systematic review published in the Lancet a year or so ago, Characteristics of Successful Programs Targeting Gender Inequality and Restrictive Gender Norms for the Health and Well-Being of Children, Adolescents, and Young Adults, a systematic review by Levy and team. This looked at a huge body of work and identified over 60 studies which were then analyzed. Anna Kagiston and I were invited by the Lancet to contribute a commentary, which is shown on this slide as well. And the comments that I make in this presentation are drawn from the paper and from the commentary. Let's now talk about what do we mean by gender transformative programs. In this slide, you'll see 4 points. One is that they foster critical examination of gender inequalities and norms. Two is that they recognize and strengthen positive norms that support equality. Three, they promote the relative position of those who have been marginalized. And lastly, they work to address the underlying systems and structures which actually create the basis for inequality. In this slide, the concept is developed further. So gender transformative programs are not gender blind. They're not just gender aware. They're not gender exploitative. They're not gender accommodating. They're transformative. And to be transformative, you have the 4 points that we went over in the previous slide. So they really address this grab the bull by its horns and address this to develop gender equality. As I said in the introduction, this systematic review of 61 evaluations of 59 programs from around the world clearly concludes that when well-designed and well-executed gender transformative programs improve health-related attitudes and behaviors, and in some cases, health outcomes of children, adolescents, and young adults. And that's an important finding. It's a clear finding from a huge body of. This slide is just to give you a sense of the geographic scope of these initiatives. And you can see that they are from around the world, including many low and middle income countries, and they address a number of health outcomes. For the purposes of this discussion, they do address gender-based violence. They address violence, and within that, they address gender-based violence as well. The most common activities that they carried out are listed on this slide: education, awareness raising, and community engagement. The focus is mostly on building individual agency, but some essential elements of high-quality programs included activities that went beyond that: multi-level, multi-sectoral activities, including some income generation, but the majority are focused at the individual level. What this essentially means is that most of these initiatives included approaches that are defined by the UN as comprehensive sexuality education. So they were built into their initiatives. Let me now move to the findings of this big review. 3 in 4 evaluations showed improved indicators related to health and gender equality, mostly knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors. While changes in health outcomes and behaviors were limited, the strong evidence of the interventions in changing gender norms. Again, this is an issue that we come up with again and again. Let's look at this in some more detail, because that's the focus of this presentation. 26 of the 61 evaluations addressed physical, sexual, or emotional violence. 13 of the evaluations measured health outcomes. Not surprising. Many evaluations do not go that far in the logic model. 10 of the 59 initiatives showed broad changes in gender norms. Violence was addressed by around 4 in 10 initiatives, 4 out of the 10 initiatives. Within the small proportion of evaluations that examined changes in health outcomes, there were changes in 2. One in Zimbabwe, which was not significant, and one in Canada, which was significant in terms of perpetration and experience of violence. There were changes in other behaviors in Nicaragua, which related to violence, but not in perpetration and experience. My last slide on this study is that there are areas of improvement, especially related to the long-term impact of the programs and synergy with the structural factors. So, the 5 points listed here are calling for studies of long-term impact, looking for the collective change rather than the individual change, the need to address complexity and implementation lessons, the need to focus on boys in their own right without taking away the space created for women's empowerment. Boys and young men have needs but then addressing their needs should not take away from the space that needs to be created and enlarged for girls and women. And finally, this whole issue of addressing the underlying structural and systemic determinants of inequality. So why is this important? These are some selected findings from a huge study called Udaya, Understanding the Lives of Adolescents and Young Adults in 2 states of India, study by the Population Council, looking at young adolescents as well as older ones. And I've just pulled out 5 points to make, to stress the importance of going beyond knowledge and understanding and the limitation of approaches at the individual level which focus on individual change. Firstly, none of the huge numbers of girls studied in these 2 states, which are 2 states in India with the weakest health and social indicators. None of them wanted to get married earlier, to have a child immediately after marriage. However, 3 in 4 of them were married by 18 and 4 in 10 were mothers by that age. Within marriage, 2 in 5 experienced violence, and whatever autonomy they had, even as younger girls, disappeared once they were married. Once they were married, they were kept under much tighter control and scrutiny. So essentially, adolescent girls want to do something with their lives. They really want to change what happened to their mothers when they were young, but economic constraints and social norms crippled them from doing that. And not surprisingly, they had they were anxious, and there were clearly depressive symptoms. So the point here is that this is an extreme case in a very special circumstances, poor, high social norms, but the general principle applies. Young people in many places do not have the power. In some places they do, and some in all places some of them do. But we need to take into account that education on its own is not enough for change to occur. The second part of my presentation deals with the Global Early Adolescence Study, a multi-country study on gender socialization, how girls and boys learn about their respective roles as required by society, and the implications of this on their health and well-being. One of the key messages from the Global Early Adolescence Study is that early adolescence is a critical window of opportunity to create more equal gender attitudes and norms. 2 key messages from this part of my presentation are that early adolescence is a critical time to promote gender equality and build a foundation for future health. And 2, there's growing attention to young adolescents in the project context. This needs to be scaled up to programs to reach the many adolescents in low and middle income countries. Phase 1 of the Global Early Adolescence Study consisted of formative research and tool development. So the tools that were developed are listed on the slide, and they're all available both on the websites of the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and on the websites of WHO. Key findings from the phase 1 of the Global Early Adolescence Study are that unequal gender attitudes are common in early adolescence. And this was findings from 15 sites around the world. The second point is puberty is a critical time of gender socialization. It's a time when the fixed thinking of the childhood opens up to new possibilities for examining things, exploring things, and forming new conclusions. Parents and peers are key in shaping gender beliefs, and there is growing influence of social media. And as I indicated earlier, This is a time when attitudes and norms are open to change. Phase 2 of the Global Early Adolescent Study is currently underway. This includes longitudinal studies in a number of countries to examine how gender attitudes and norms influence health outcomes in the area of sexual and reproductive health and beyond that. And there are 3 points that I'd like to share with you from the editorial commentary in the recently published Journal of Adolescent Health supplement titled Perceptions of Gender Norms and Adolescent Health Findings from the Global Early Adolescent Study. The other points are that unequal stereotypical gender traits and roles and sexual double standards exist in every country, but to varying degrees, and they reinforce gender inequalities. These unequal norms contribute to poorer health and may contribute to shifting disparities among genders. The studies demonstrate that gender matters, but the gender norms operate in complex ways. In the studies reported in this supplement, it was not clearly logical. The patterns were not all clean. So they are complex and they may vary between persons and even within the same person on different issues. As I mentioned earlier, there are a number of interesting projects. Some of them have been taken to scale, but they're still in the context of NGO-led initiatives. Governments are slowly getting involved, and the initiatives are listed on this slide, and you can find more information on them in the Lancet review that I mentioned. This slide contains a number of references of articles that I've cited in the review, in my presentation, and you're welcome to draw from them and build your understanding in this area. And we'd be very happy to hear back from you. I'd like to share 5 implications of the findings from the Global Early Adolescent Study for policies and programs. The first one is that we need to engage with adolescents in open discussions about gender norms and attitudes that take into account their evolving capacities. As individuals move from older childhood to young adolescence and then middle adolescence, their thinking moves from concrete to abstract. And as they grow and develop cognitively and emotionally, this is a wonderful time to engage them in discussions. It's important to be aware that girls are aware of gender inequalities, girls in every place. Some accept this as the norm that cannot be changed, and others are willing to challenge them. Boys are often blind to gender inequalities. They do not see the value. Even if they are not blind, they do not see the value of forsaking the privileges they have. And when boys, and some boys, adopt more equitable attitudes and behaviors, they face punitive sanctions from the people around them, including women, including mothers and aunts and sisters. The second point is that we need to stimulate critical reflection to change attitudes and norms within peer groups. It's okay to work at the individual level. It's important to do that. But it's much more important to work with groups of adolescents. Peers can have a positive or negative influence. Peer connectedness, peer modeling, and awareness of peer norms can be protective, but it can also increase risks. And this is an important issue to engage with. Continuing this point, in order to reach young people, we absolutely have to tap into the reach and influence of media and technology. Peer group in many places at least partially functions online. The third point is that we need to incorporate content on gender equitable norms in parenting interventions. As I mentioned earlier, parents are a huge influence. Many of the things we learn about how to treat people in general, how to treat people of our own sex or the other sex, or about attitudes towards non-binary individuals are learned at home. Race and thinking about race is learned at home.
And so we need to make sure that in work with parents, we include gender consideration. The fourth point, and a critically important one, is that we absolutely need to work at different levels of a socio-ecological framework. The Save the Children has a wonderful set of tools. It starts with choices, working at the level of individual, older children and adolescents, at the level of the family, a tool called Voices, to allow adolescents to have voices, and then working at the community level for the community to give adolescents the opportunity to develop to their full promise. We've talked about working with parents. We've talked about working at multiple levels, at the individual level, at the family level, and at the community level. And a very important place to reach adolescents is the school, in the school setting, but also in the community setting. Community setting can be both complementary to what is going on in the school, but also for those adolescents who are not in school, it may be the only place where we can reach them with such intervention. Another important influence is media. So much of the learning is from media. We've talked about social media, but also movies and television programs. Here's an analysis of the place and the privilege given to men in programs in one particular study. This is entirely consistent with findings in many places. My last point is that yes, we need to work on gender attitudes and norms, and there are windows of opportunity to do this as shown in this slide. But as researchers such as those involved in young lives who are following longitudinal trajectories of children and young people in Vietnam, in India, in Peru, and in Ethiopia, say these windows should be treated with caution. The drivers of change for disadvantaged adolescents are opportunity to study, to work, and to be protected. And those are very, very important ways in which an individual is framed and an individual grows and develops. That brings me to the end of my presentation. It's been a privilege to share this thinking with you, and I look forward very much to hearing back from you. Namaste and goodbye.